morning, everybody. Welcome back. Good to see you with us this morning. We're here doing the story behind the Psalms. Today we're at Psalms 50. There's 50 verses in this psalm. Today we're at Psalms 18. Psalms 18. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning, John. Good morning, everybody.
I'm not a numerologist. I never was good at numbers. Good at math, but not at, anyway, on to that. But Psalms 18, great, interesting psalm. It's, as I said, it's 50 verses, so we're going to kind of break from our pattern of reading it. But Roger and I come today with a little different perspective. We both end up at the same place, but a little different perspective of what exactly is the backstory of this psalm, because as you know, we don't have a lot of clarity on these backstories, but we're taking our cues from the postscripts that are written right before the psalm, and right before Psalm 18 in the NIV Bible, and your Bible may have another one. The postscript says, "For the director of music," which is always interesting. The main director is always God. "Of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, he said," and then it goes into the psalm. And so we have this prescript that David wrote this after God had delivered him from the hand of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And I think it's just so peculiar, so interesting. And as we referenced last week, Roger and I both did, that David never took an enemy type stand towards Saul. Saul was always in David's mind God's anointed. Saul was always the man that David was to respect. Even though Saul tried to kill him, Saul was enraged by him. Saul was bothered by him. Every word you could think of, Saul was that to David, but David always respected Saul, respected his position as king, and respected his position before God. And so I think it's just peculiar that it says David writes this psalm after God had delivered him from all his enemies and from Saul. He didn't consider Saul an enemy, is my point. So anyway, Roger's going to jump in and tell us his perspective, then I'm going to tell you mine, and then we'll go into kind of a devotional outline of the book.
Okay. And both our perspectives are supported by different commentators, so you can go either way. And we just thought we'd give both arguments.
Right.
So we want you to actually read it and think about it, and hey, it's open for discussion. You can make up your own mind on this.
Right.
So my position is that this psalm comes late in David's life, and I take that position, one, because I'm going to give you another couple of chapters here to think about, but also just that beginning of that it was after the Lord had delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And remember, David was this warrior shepherd king, and David wanted to build the temple, and God said, "Hey, that's great." And in fact, God was actually surprised, I believe, that David said, "I want to build you this temple." And later on, David says, and it's actually in Kings that he says it, but that God told him that he had too much blood on his hands and that he couldn't be the builder of the temple, but that there would be a time of peace after David's reign, and then that's when the temple would be built. And we know that was during Solomon's time. So I think that, by this time, David has wrapped up all his battles. The blood is kind of ended on his hands. Saul is long dead. And then to me, so the chapters that I kind of go with are 2 Samuel 22. And 2 Samuel 22 is David's song of praise. And it's basically almost the same song.
Almost word for word.
Almost word for word. It gets changed a little bit in Psalm 18. It gets a little bit cleaned up for the temple, the church. And then when you go into chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, it starts 23 verse 1. These are the last words of David. So it's right there before his last words. So it could be argued that it's in chronological order, and that, it was towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
So there's one viewpoint.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of reiterate what Roger just said, that I think is fascinating, that state it clearly, but just so nobody misses it, Psalms 18 that we're looking at today is almost verbatim of 2 Samuel 22. I mean, you could lay those two, if you want to call them chapters, Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, you could lay them side by side and they're almost word for word. And so Roger's taken that Psalms 18 was written at the end of David's life, as he was about to die, and kind of re-looking over all his life. And I think where Roger, at that, back to the prescript of Psalm 18, where it says David wrote this after God had delivered him from all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, Roger's going with all his enemies. I'm going with the hand of Saul, because I'm going to go with 2 Samuel chapter 2 through 5, which is the actual recounting, well, even all the way back to 1 Samuel 15, which I went back that far, but we won't go there yet. But at the beginning of 2 Samuel, at the death of Saul, again, David is still maintaining this high view of Saul. It's interesting that a servant comes and tells David that Saul is dead, and then David ends up, and the servant says, "I killed him. I wanted to run to you and tell you that I killed Saul. Saul is now dead," thinking that David would rejoice in that.
Right.
But David ends up killing this guy because this guy killed the king. And David said, you think you're coming to me.
And he actually lied. He didn't kill him.
He did, right.
Correct.
Saul fell on his sword.
Correct.
But he told David he killed the king.
Correct.
And so David said, you're not going to die because you killed the king. And I'm not going to allow that because Saul is the king. Again, David maintaining that high standard, even though Saul was out to kill him pretty much all of his life. And so then you have 2 through 5, which is the story of David kind of establishing himself not only as king of Judah, but as king of Israel. And there's the story of Saul's son appointing himself as king of a portion of Israel, and that man ends up dying, and Joab kind of is involved. And then you have, at the end of chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, you have David, the Philistines find out David is now king over all of Israel, and the Philistines come and wage war, and David pauses and prays, "God, do you want me to go to battle with the Philistines?" And God says, "Yes, go." And then in the end of that, very end of that chapter, I think in verse 22 of chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, David again asks God, on another time, the Philistines came back a second time, "Do you want me to go to battle against the Philistines?" And God says, "Don't go straight at them. Kind of take a defensive kind of move and go around behind them and attack." And David does that and is victorious. And in both instances, David gives credit for God protecting him from his enemies. And so I'm taking it early in David's kingship, because you have these stories in 2 Samuel 2 through 5 of God finally delivering David from the hand of Saul, in a sense, and God delivering David in some specific situations from Saul's son, who was appointed himself as king and tried to rival David, and also these early stories of God delivering David from the Philistines. So there you go. We want to hear from you. Is it an early psalm in David's life? And my take on Psalm 22, getting my numbers mixed up again. My take on 2 Samuel 22 is David is now at the end of his life, and he's looking back and he is recounting that psalm that he wrote early in his life. That's my take on the repetitive nature of 2 Samuel 22, that he didn't speak it for the first time at the end of his life, but he wrote it early, but then at the end of his life, he repeats it once again, kind of reminding himself as God has prepared him.
And then there's my view of that it's written later in the chronological events, in that when David later on in Psalm 18 talks about praising that you subdued the nations, and that I praise you among the nations, and all these,
right.
But that the nations, it's done. The battles have been fought, and so it's towards the end, it's towards the time of peace.
Yeah.
You make the call.
Yeah.
It's like football.
It's football. and again, my take on the nations passage, it's interesting. We keyed off different words. Is the nations, every time the word nations, well, not every time, but the majority of the time the word nations is used in the Old Testament, it's talking about those people who don't worship Yahweh as their God, the Gentiles, in other words. And so in the stories of, you have the story in 2 through 5 in 2 Samuel, you have again the Philistines, you have Tyre, you have these nations that David takes concubines and wives from the nations, and so God subdued the nations there. So there's evidences of both.
That's right.
This is how we get along, see?
Yeah, exactly.
We're in different places, we still love each other, we still talk to each other. If COVID was over, I'd sit on his lap and we would teach you that way. That would be the time that nobody watches, but we'll go on. So there's kind of the backstory of how we get here, that God has, whether you take Roger's perspective or my perspective, in both cases, the power of the story is, whichever time in David's life you write it, God delivered him.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what David is rejoicing over in Psalms 18, is David was in dire straits. David cried out to God, and God showed up powerfully. I think that's the cool thing. And then David talks about his present and his future understanding. Is kind of how I divide the Psalm 18 out. So I want to jump into it?
Sure.
Let's jump into it. And so first of all, in the first section, I think the first section is verses 1 through 3 is David kind of praising God for his deliverance. And David starts in a very interesting way, I think. He says, God, I love you. You know, he just plain and simple. I think he's sitting there thinking back over how God has delivered him, and he just starts the psalm with this bold, confident acknowledgement of how he feels about God. God, and again, there he goes. He says, I love you, Yahweh. I love you, God. You are my strength. And that the word love there in Hebrew is that love between a man and a wife, that deep, compassionate, heartfelt, powerful love. And David just begins this psalm by looking back over his victories he's had, or back over his life, and just says, man, God, I love you. You know, what a cool way to start it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then he jumps in, and then he lists a bunch of words that speak of safety and deliverance. Just count them up. Lord, you are my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. God is my rock in whom I take refuge. I've run out of fingers. My shield, the horn of my salvation, the stronghold. There's 8. And then in verse 3, I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. So 8 different ways David acknowledges that God is his rescuer.
Yeah.
I think that's just cool.
And most of those are, when you look at them, rock, from whom I take refuge. That could also be the cleft of the rock is another definition of that. And then just the rock, the physical rock itself.
Right.
Then you've got the rock with whom you take refuge, with the cleft of the rock. And that so many of those are actually natural, awesome things of nature.
Right.
And then he's got a few human things in there, fortress and the shield, the horn of my salvation. The horn of my salvation could be a couple of different things too.
Right.
That could be one. There's always in the ancient world the horned animals are the strongest animals, and so you've got the ox, you've got all these the rhinoceros, you name it, you name an animal with horns,
with a big horn. He's tough.
Yeah, they're tough, and so the horn was always a symbol of strength, and rulers always had horns. If you notice, most of the ancient gods, if you go back and look through ancient art, the gods all had horns in some way associated with them, so strength. But then you also have the horns of the altar, and the fact that was a place of refuge. If you could hold on to the horn, which is the corner of the altar of sacrifice. So there's a couple of different meanings there too.
Yeah, and again, I think that's one of the things that words are so powerful. And I don't know if you been watching our discovery class with Carol and I on the book of Colossians, where we're taking particular words and just having devotional. And here's a devotional thoughts and your own. Just take a word and look up some stuff on the internet that you can find and see the significance. I don't think I really don't think, even under the inspiration of Scripture, that David's just spouting off a bunch of words here. I think every one of these words, the rocks, the clefts, the deliverer, the horns, the shields, all those things have power and significance to David, and that's why he's using them. And I think, that I just mentioned 8 different ways that David right here in the first 3 verses acknowledges who God is. Pick one of those words and just dig into it. Just study it. Just Google it and find out what it meant in the mind of David as he was inspired, but also what it meant to those people. I think, as Roger said, he mentions rock twice, and one rock was the cleft of the rock, kind of the refuge where you hide out from your enemies or you hide from the heat of the day. And the other one was the word for rock, like a big boulder. So he's saying, God, you are my rock. In one place, the Hebrew word is that safety, but in other places is you are the rock. You are that unmovable force that sits out there that nobody can mess with. That's who you are. So it's just kind of study those words. That's a free thought there. So that's the first section. Then 4 through 6, he talks about the danger that he's in. And he says, the cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. And from his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. And again, lots of words. The cords of death, the cords of the grave, the snares of the death, in his distress. That entanglement of death. I mean, he's trying to paint the picture that he's tangled up with it. To me, it kind of reminds me of how Jonah was describing the seaweed wrapped around his neck and the waves overpowering him, being drugged down to Sheol. And again, the Hebrew words here for death are Sheol, the place of the dead. And David's saying, I'm because my enemies are all around me. They're ensnaring me. They're entangling me. I'm caught up in the whirl, in the riptides of death. But I cried out to God. Mm-hmm. And I think it's such a cool imagery that he says, I cried out to God, and God in his temple, that spiritual place, wherever, last week we talked about the mountain, the holy mountain of God. And this time David says, God heard me in his temple. Obviously the physical temple's not been built yet.
Right.
So we have to think the spiritual temple, God is in heaven up in the temple. And so he says, God in his temple, wherever that is, heard my cry, heard my voice, and my cry came before him and into his ears. To me, that imagery speaks to that imagery that a mom has. No matter where the child is, the mom can hear the baby crying. Mm-hmm. That kind of close connection that I remember when our girls were little, and one of them would be crying, and I'm like, what? I didn't hear anything. It's like, oh, they're moving. And I was like, sure enough, I was dead asleep. Yeah. But I think there's that imagery, I think, of the closeness again that David saying, I love you, Lord. That closeness that David has with God, that David was confident that when he cried out, no matter where he was, that God heard his voice in the ears of God. I think that's a beautiful imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. So then in verses 17 to 15, there's David paints this a theophany, this divine encounter of God. A manifestation of God in a tangible, sensible form that we can all kind of recognize, both through nature and also through and physically. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting that the words that he uses, it really speaks of something like John when he describes things in Revelation, but the powerfulness of God, and some of the, I'll let you read through the section about, but the earth trembled and quaked, the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. Yeah. Smoke came from his nostrils because he was angry. Yeah. The vivid imagery, and consuming fire from his mouth. Later on, he talks about that God mounted the cherubims and flew and soared towards the earth on the wings of the wind. I mean, just fantastic imagery.
It would be a great scene in the movie.
Oh, absolutely.
Just an action movie, and he just Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, that's okay.
No.
And then God's power over nature with, the clouds advanced, hailstones, bolts of lightning. He did all of these things to deliver them, in which, when we look back, even in the past stories of the Israelites, there were times of hailstones, killing livestock and soldiers, and all these different things. And so he's going with that vivid imagery again. And then he shot his arrows, he scattered the enemy. The valleys and the seas were exposed, the foundations of the earth laid bare at your rebuke, and the blast of your breath sounds from your nostrils. So just beautiful,
vivid language. And again, what I walk, and again, it's we should read it, but just read it for yourself, because it's the imagery that David pulls out of his back pocket is just so wild. And to me, it's saying, you get this image that David is in trouble. The torrents of death are swirling around his neck. God is sitting up in his temple somewhere, and David cries out to God while these torrents are wrapping around him and swirling about him. And David's cry for help reaches the ears of God, and God just doesn't sit there for a few days.
Right.
God just doesn't sit there and, David's in trouble. David is saying that when our cries reach the temple of God and come before him, and our cries enter the ears of God, God powerfully moves.
Right. He personally will come, and he will move mountains, break the earth, lay the earth bare. God is on the move when you call him.
That's what David, and that's the cool thing, that God's just not going to go, let me finish my sandwich and I'll come help you out, or let me finish this show and then I'll do that. No, when our cries for help reach the ears of God, God comes in powerful, using Roger's words, vivid ways to our rescue. And I think that's what I get out of this psalm so far. And David said, I experienced that with the Philistines, with the issues with Saul's son, from Roger's perspective throughout his whole life. David cried out to God, and every time God delivers him. And in verse 16, the next section, God shows up and brings David to safety. He reached down from on high and took hold of me and drew me out of the depths of the water. He rescued me from my powerful enemies, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. I love that imagery that at one point the torrents of death were tangled all around him, and he felt like he was collapsing and his enemies were too great, and God comes in power and sets him in a spacious place.
Right. Yeah, he was no longer surrounded by his enemies. He wasn't closed in, he wasn't pinned in, he wasn't held anymore.
Yeah, just the imagery is just really inspired.
And David loves, well, I shouldn't say loves the imagery, but he's used it also when you look in other Psalms. Psalm 31 is another one where he uses that similar imagery of you finally, the pressure is off. I'm out in the open. Well, he was a shepherd. I'm back in the beautiful pasture.
Right.
Nothing is threatening me.
Yeah.
And here I am.
Yep. Yeah, and then almost to Psalm 23, you set a table before me in the very presence of my enemies. They're on the other side of the tent watching. It's just that I'm at peace, I'm at rest. The psalm we dealt with last week, when trouble was all around me, I went to sleep. It's that confidence that he has in God.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. Psalm 20 to 20, once again, Psalm 18, verses 20 to 24. These are some really good ones. We'll read these four because once again, there's some good discussion on this one. The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands, he has rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord. I am not guilty of turning from my God. All his laws are before me. I have not turned away from his decrees. I have been blameless before him, and I have kept myself from sin. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight.
Yeah. Again, David uses a lot of words, over and over again, and just kind of refresh. The Lord has dealt with me. God, I cried out to God. God came in power, sets me in a spacious place. David says, okay, let's pause for a minute and say, why did God do that? Did God do that because I'm an evil crook? No. Did God do that because he does that to everybody? No. Here's why God delivered me. The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, my cleanliness. I've kept his ways. I've not done evil. His laws are before me. Run out of fingers again. I've not done evil. I've not turned away. I've been blameless. I've kept myself from sin, and and according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. I counted 10 different ways David said God dealt with me because I'm blameless.
Yeah.
Again, back to our different perspectives, okay? My perspective is this is early in his life, pre-Bathsheba, that David could say this with confidence. Roger's saying at the end of his life because
through God's grace, David's asking for forgiveness, humbling himself before God. David has accepted that grace and forgiveness, and he's at peace with God. He's made his peace with it.
Right. So the presence of grace in the Old Testament, a lot of people say it's not there, but it is. Right. And I think if you take a late period in David's life of writing this psalm, you could go, okay, there's grace because David's experienced the forgiveness of God.
There's a difference too between, remember Saul, Samuel came to him numerous times and says, God wants you to do it this way or do this. And Saul either wouldn't do it God's way or didn't do it. And so Saul wanted to be his own man, his own king. David always realized that he had been anointed by God and that God was the true king and David was the king on earth, and that everything was, that he had his responsibility for the earthly kingdom, but God was still the one in charge. And so there was that aspect too, that David always kept himself in that mindset. Even when he committed sin, he still did that. And if you look back just one chapter in Psalm, or one Psalm back, Psalm 17, verses 3 through 5, though you probe my heart, though you examine me at night and test me, you will find that I have planned no evil. My mouth has not transgressed. Though people tried to bribe me, I've kept myself from the ways of the violent. Through what your lips have commanded, my steps have held to your paths. My feet have not stumbled. He says that. And then back in Psalm 14, verses 2 and 3, David says, the Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. So David is kind of even, you can take those words and move them to Paul in Romans 3:23, that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So David makes, I think too, he's got these cases that he's made of that, he knows everyone's corrupt. Everyone has a sinful nature. He asks God to continually search and probe his heart, but David always deals with his sin. So
great point. So again, take either side, but again, the point is God rescued him, and God rescued him because David said, my hands are clean, because I'm blameless before the Lord. Whether I'm blameless because I have done no sin, or I'm blameless because I have righteously dealt with the sin in my life and experienced God's forgiveness. And then,
good example, just for us nowadays.
Yeah.
Because we've all sinned. And so that whole thing of accepting God's grace, laying our life bare and saying, okay, I'm transparent before God. You know my faults, you know my sins, you know my bad habits, you know everything else. But I'm going to lay myself open before you, probe me night and day, show me the ways that I can be more like you.
Absolutely. Very cool. It's a powerful psalm, The more you get into it, the more you're like, we could stay here a long time.
Yes, we could.
Yes, we could. But then he continues on. This shows just how much more there is here. Then he continues on in verse 25. He goes, okay, kind of a parenthetical thought. The torrents of death are around me. God shows up powerfully. He sets me in a spacious place. Why did he do this? Because my hands are blameless. And he says, parenthetically, I'm going to step back a minute and give a little editorial comment. And he says, to the faithful, show yourselves faithful. To the blameless, you better show yourself blameless. To the pure, show yourselves pure. It sounds like he's doing some beatitudes here. But he's interesting. But to the crooked, show yourself to the crooked you show yourself shrewd. But you save the humble, but bring low those whose eyes are haughty. And he says just be careful. To the pure, show yourself to be pure. But those of you who are crooked, who are just showing yourself to be something you're not, be careful. Be careful. David gives a parenthetical thought about others that might be listening to this saying, well, wait a second, why isn't God showing up like that for me? I think he's what he's saying. Why isn't God showing up powerfully like that for me, David? And David says, maybe because you're crooked and you're just showing yourself to be shrewd, and your eyes are haughty. So be careful. And then he moves again. He says, Lord, verses 28. He kind of shifts gears. He's been talking about it to this point in my outline, talking about the past. And now David kind of shifts into the present. You, O Lord, keep my lamp burning. My God turns my darkness into light. With your help, I can advance against a troop. With my God, I can scale a wall. For as for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is flawless. He is my shield. Into the verse 30. For all who take refuge in him, he kind of pauses and says, God is a present help with me every day. God, you show me how to do stuff.
Yeah. Once again, the 360-degree shield. He's a shield for all who take refuge in him.
Right. Then he kind of moves on. Like I said, we skip into a. Go ahead.
I'm verse 31. No. He has two rhetorical questions that he, but and that one. So verse 31, he says, "For who is God besides the Lord, and who is the rock except our God?" So he's saying, I know our God is the one and true only God. He is, and he is the God of Israel. He is the God of the nations. He is my God. And so it's like, who else is there?
Who else is there? Yeah, I think there's this cosmology going on in David's world, that there are all these gods out there. There's the Baal gods and the Babylonian gods and the Syrian gods and all these gods, and when you talk about Yahweh is over all the nations, all those different nations had their own gods. And David is just coming around and saying, nobody's like him. Our God, Yahweh, the God I love, the God that shows up and delivers me, is over and above all those other gods. He is the Lord of all the lords. I think that's what that means. So good point. And then in verse 30, 32 to 36, I'll kind of run through these next ones pretty quick. David acknowledges that his strength and his expertise in battle comes from God. Yeah. He just makes it real clear. He says, it is God who arms me with strength. He makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like a deer. He trains my hands for battle. All the military expertise and skills I have, David said, didn't come from me. All that comes from God.
Yeah, I agree. And his success. And he says it again. Psalm 144 is kind of a warrior psalm of David. And in verse 1 says, "Praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle."
Yeah. So David just acknowledges in this section of Psalms 18 that all my skill is not my own. All my skill comes from God. And then in the next section, 37 through 42, he says, God hands over all the enemies to me. I don't do it again by my expertise. I just follow God's orders. Like in 2 Samuel chapter 5, I just say, God, you want me to go to fight the Philistines? Yes. God, you want me to go fight the Philistines this time? No. Go around behind them. So he says, it is God who hands the enemies over to me. Verse 37, I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back till they were destroyed. Verse 40, you made my enemies turn their backs in flight, and I destroyed. They cried for help, but there was no one to save them. To the Lord, but he did not answer. I beat them. So again, this God, you gave them over to my hands. I didn't do it because I'm a mighty man of battle, although he was. God, all credit goes to you. Again, what Roger brought out a moment ago by Saul kind of took a different perspective, that he was the mighty warrior. He was not only king of the earthly realm. Saul kind of saw himself as king over the whole spiritual realm, but David keeps that right perspective. And again, something that we need to keep in mind, that my skills, my abilities, whatever they might be, weak or strong, come from God. And as I encounter people, God gets the blessings in whatever happens.
Yeah. There's a kind of in some ways it almost sounds boastfulness, but when you really read through this, David really has a sense of piety, which is defined as reverence. Meaning he reveres God. He and so don't take it that that David is saying, well, because of you, I did this. It's not about I. And you really read that.
You really do. He acknowledges that he is successful.
Correct.
But he acknowledges at the very same time, the success comes from God. Right. The success is not my part. That all success comes from God. And then in ending up verses 43 through 49, David just reiterates again that it is God who is establishing David as king. You have delivered me from the attacks of people. Verse 43, I'm reading. You have delivered me from the attacks of people. You have made me the head of the nations. People I did not know are subject to me. And he goes on in verse 46, the Lord lives, praise be to my rock, exalted be God my Savior. He is the God who avenges me, who subdues the nations under me, who saves me from my enemies. You exalted me above my foes. Again, David is just pausing and looking back over, for me, the experiences of 2 Samuel 2 through 5 and saying, God, you have done all this. Roger's perspective, he looks back over his whole life and says, God, you have done all this. And so he's just saying, I'm just standing back in awe of what you've done, God. And then verse 50, he kind of closes it out.
Verse 50, he gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing love to his anointed, to David, and to his descendants forever, which meant a number of different things. So he brings out earlier, he talks about in verse 49, he says, therefore I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing the praises of your name. So David had this realization, one of the Abrahamic promise that through Abraham, great nations would come about. That's like Genesis chapter 12, and I think it's even like verse 3. Yeah. So through you, I will create a great nations. And so then he's also got the Davidic covenant here, which, to David and his descendants forever, where David was promised by God that someone from David's line would always be present on the throne, which we know is Jesus. Yeah. And so Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, and then to the descendants forever. It's kind of an amazing verse where he just he sums everything up in one. Like
a doxology, as we say, just kind of a summing it all up. So there in a quick overview is Psalms 18, where David takes his experiences and says, God, I'm drowning here. And God heard his cry, and God came with power and delivered him and set him in a spacious place. And then David says, God did this because my hands are blameless. I am pure before the Lord. I am in a right relationship with my God. And then he recounts over how God has given him abilities. God has given him skills. God has given him, handed his enemies over to him. God has established his kingdom. And then he just says, God, you are amazing. You are exalted. You are above all nations. And for you, all praise and glory belongs.
So what do we get out of it today, John?
Absolutely. That's the great question.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool psalm.
Yeah, cool
Click.
psalm.
But no, what's it for us today? So what's your take?
Obviously, David starts even, with expressing his love for God. That's one of the big things first. You're my love, my strength. And so that's where he goes to.
Right.
And then I think part of it is, the fact that David is just so willing to express his emotions, express his thoughts to God, crying out in his distress, throwing everything at God and saying, I know that you can help me through this time. I know that you can fix this, and you are the ultimate God. And even like we talked about with his interactions with Saul, that he did not need to. That Saul was God's anointed, and so therefore David said, "No, you will fix the problem. I don't have to put my hands on him. Right. You're going to take him out of the office of king in any way that you choose, and you're in charge." Yeah. So I think that you have that ultimate expression of David relying upon God, and then also later on, just I truly find it that the way that David is like. Once again, back to that Psalm 17 of, probe me, just search my heart, but then I can truly stand open and honest before you and say, I'm righteous and my ways are righteous in your sight. So therefore, please help me in this situation.
I think I walk away with several of those same points, that just the raw emotion David brings to these Psalms, which is, I think, a lesson for us in our devotion and our quiet time, that we can just have our emotions raw before God. God, I love you. Wow, you have shown up so many times in my life, and I have this deep compassion because I know my position before you. I bow before you. And then for me again too, just those, I feel in my own life recently, days like today, the torrents of death are swirling around me. I have that imagery of Jonah, where Jonah, the weeds are pulling him to the bottom of the sea. I'm going down to the depths of Sheol, and David felt that, and we feel that, and in the weird days of our society and in everything that's going on in life with us today, we feel that, and the confidence that we can have. Again, that imagery that I am drowning here, and my cries for help reach the ears of God in His holy temple, and He doesn't just sit there and go, "Yeah, I hear you." Mm-hmm. That He comes with power and majesty and vivid strength to rescue me and set me in a spacious place. I think that's a comfort that we can have, and not just a comfort we can that's kind of pretty and nice words, but that's in reality what happens. That Jesus is with us all the time as we are blameless before Him, as Roger said, we've accepted His grace and mercy into our lives. We have the confidence that Jesus, God in His fullness, is with us all the time to protect us and care for us. I think that's just a cool thought, a devotional thought for me in these days. And then the acknowledgement, the other thing that my walk away from is the acknowledgement of David, that God provided all that there is. That David says, I want to be a good steward of everything you've given me, God. You've given me these skills for warfare. You've handed all these enemies over to me. You've established me as king where people want to come and bow down before me. God, all that comes from you, and I just want to be a good steward of the things you've placed in my hand. I think that's a reminder for me too.
Yeah, that's a fantastic one. And then finally, David once again, he remembers to praise God for what He's done, and he also relies, in verse 50, he relies on God's promises. Yeah. Both the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant. So just like we look in Scripture and the promises of Jesus, and we rely upon those promises. And David says, I rely upon them, and I know they're true.
Yeah. So that's where we leave with you for Psalms 18. We'd love to hear from you what your perspective of it is, and then I just whether you take an early writing of Psalms 18 or a late writing of Psalms 18, here's the walk away for me, that David wrote it down. Yeah. David, whether it was at the end of his life or at the beginning of his kingship, establishing his kingdom, he wrote this down, and he was able to reflect on who God is in his life. And I challenge you, if you're the kind of person that likes to journal, likes to jot things down, man, instead of just praying a prayer, write it down, tuck it away somewhere. At the end of our life, we might find it in our Bible and pull it out again and read it as our final words. So with that, we say, God bless you. Thanks for watching. Be safe out there. Be wise. And as we always say, be the church.
Be the church. Thanks for being with us today.
God bless you.